She's very invested in this, isn't she, Rabbi? He wants to make sure we get the law right.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize to everyone for not getting connected last week. I just could not get out of bed.
Mm.
Okay.
My whole life has changed.
Take care of yourself.
I will. You want to start with the blessing, Rabbi?
Okay, are we ready to start?
I think so.
Are you ready with the blessing? 1, 2, 3. Baruch great Torah.
Blessed are you, our God.
Adonai, our God, ruler of the world,
Sanctify us with your commandments.
your commandments, and us to engage in the words of Torah.
Amen.
Amen. Can everyone hear and see me okay?
I see you and hear you fine.
Okay.
And I just got a phone call. Why did this happen?
Okay. So, let's see
Yes,
here. So we're down to 6 people. So you think this is a summer problem, or that we'll be back to a higher number in the fall? Maybe you want to give a little pitch at a Friday night service sometime, or even on the high holy.
I think it's temporary. Pam, I know it's book club this afternoon. I don't know what's going on this morning.
We have a new person too.
Richard.
We have a new person supposed to be on today.
And see, I guess we have a lot of new members. There's a tremendous movement. We lose members, we gain members, and the new members may not be aware of this so much. So yeah, the more that you can personally solicit people, the better.
Yeah.
And we have to be constantly in recruitment mode. And see, that's how I got Lily to participate, Okay, so we are on Tzedek Terdof this time. And Shirley brought Lily with her from Alabama. And that was already quite a few years ago. And they came on the plane together, and that they wouldn't serve Lily any good food on the plane. And she said that, that was the only complaint she had. Okay, so we're on Tzedek Terdof, which is on page
132.
139. I thought we're doing
139. Target probably is on 130. No, it's not either, but it's 139.
Okay. My apologies.
Hi, Pam.
Hi, sorry, I had 2 different ways to get in. So
go for the simple one. I have a question before we start about the word tzedek that you just used, Rabbi.
Right.
The root, it's a root. Is that tzedakah? Is that the same?
No.
Yes, same.
And tzedakah are the same?
Yes, same root.
Same root, I guess, in it, right?
Same root.
Yeah.
And so, so that's, it's a tzadi, dalet kuf. So it's the same root as tzedakah and also tzedek. Tzedek means righteousness, or how they translate here is justice, which are quite different. So this is why, this is one of the most famous quotes in the Bible. I gave my opening blessing this morning at the Adult Education Committee. That Richard, are you the only one here on the Adult Education Committee today?
Looks like it.
And I spoke. I did a short version of this for them, and I'm going to talk about it Friday night. But basically, as you know, every week, every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, you're supposed to read the Torah, correct?
Didn't know that.
And then And that's what we're going to start out. Marcia has offered her house for this. So we're going to meet every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings at 6 a.m. To read the Torah, and then she's going to provide a full breakfast.
Okay.
There,
Here, okay.
there used to be a meeting
Marsha, really busy.
Wednesday at the temple. The guys would get together and they would read Torah, and then someone would make scrambled eggs with bacon, with bagels and what have you. Not with bacon, no.
Turkey bacon,
But kosher bacon, you circumcise the pig.
turkey.
And Evelyn, when did that stop?
Oh, many years ago, could be 20 years ago. there
And
were
why-
there were a group of men who actually were Orthodox. And so they felt that it was incumbent upon them to carry on the traditions. And so, in spite of the fact that we are considered a Reformed temple, they felt it would be more Hamish if they continued the practice of reading the Torah on Thursday as well as Friday night. So that was then, and the men's group got together and they did it. Obviously, interest faded as the years went by. And
Interesting. In any case, the Romans prohibited Torah readings after the Great Revolt, which I spoke about in services a few weeks ago. And the sages had to come up with something alternative. So they took sections from the prophets and they called it a Haftorah, and they read that instead of the Torah. After a few years, the Romans thought either that the Jews weren't going to rebel again, or that reading the Torah was not the source of the problem and the Jews might rebel again anyway. But in any case, they said, all right, read the Torah, it doesn't matter to us anymore. So then the Torah reading was reinstituted, but the Haftorah was kept. The problem for us is the Haftorahs, many of them are quite difficult to understand, and so people don't want to hear them. So there's a new book that came out from the Reform movement, which I contributed to, which makes new Haftorahs, things that are more relevant. So that's what I read from this morning, is that there's a letter from the synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790 to the first president, who was
George Washington.
there you go. Pam knows her American history.
That's a very famous message that he sent to that congregation.
Right. And this is the letter from the congregation to George Washington, which I think preceded Washington's response. And and in it they refer to this week's Parsha. So I read a little bit of it Friday, this morning, and we'll read the whole letter, which is not very long, this coming Friday night. Okay, so Tzedek Terdov, this is a great quote. We spoke a few weeks ago about things in the Torah that we don't identify with, and it's too bad that my friend Philip never came on to talk to us about being Orthodox and how the Orthodox are, but maybe someday. But this is something that we do identify with. So this is a week that we can be very proud of the Torah, and something that the Torah said that has really held up really, really, really well for the 2,500 or 3,000 years since it was written. So any opening thoughts about this idea? In Hebrew, tzedek terdov. In English, justice shall you pursue. Pursue, right? Not catch necessarily, pursue. It's an aspiration rather than something we expect as a done accomplishment. Pam.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg stole this, by the way. Now I know who she stole this from.
She was a shameless plagiarist.
Yes.
Now, the Deuteronomy is written by itself, probably during the time of King Josiah, which was about 620 or 660 BCE. Josiah and his advisors wanted to make a reform or a revolution in Judaism. And part of that was that they found a new scroll. And we think that that was Deuteronomy. We don't have proof, but we think. So this was relatively a new thing. And it, if you were, how many people were there that last Friday night when I did the comparison between Deuteronomy and Exodus? Nobody here was there Friday night. Oh, Shirley was.
Really was.
So only the person from the furthest away. And okay, interesting. And so I compared an excerpt from Deuteronomy with an excerpt from Exodus and showed that Deuteronomy does not just summarize the other 4 books. It actively redoes it to present new ideas that were more, in sync with what they thought at the time. Presumably, Book of Exodus had been written 200 or 300 or 400 years earlier, and so they were stuck with that. But the people that wrote Deuteronomy said, we have different ideas now, more democratic ideas, and so forth. Okay, Pam, so you like this expression?
Yes, Ruth Bader Ginsburg used it as the title for one of her books.
Yeah.
Justice, justice shall you pursue. Okay, and what did you read that book? In book club?
The book club read several books by Ruth.
Yes, we had a RBG-a-thon. We read several books.
Yes.
Wow. She's that popular among our book club. Wow. And what was your impression of her? Was she influenced by the book of Deuteronomy in particular?
I don't remember. Marcia, do you remember whether she was?
No, and that was the book I read. We all didn't read all the books. We chose a book to read by her that was written by her. I don't remember really.
Some of us read biographies of her rather than books written by her. And so you had a diversity of different viewpoints, some
she was very driven in her pursuit of justice. Yeah. One can say that. She had causes and she really pursued them, if you will. She really,
That's the same thing when we had the Goldathon. Some of them we read and some of them were books written by Golda Meir.
Yeah. There's a new movie coming out called Golda that will be
Helen Mirren at the end of the month. It's supposed to be
the 25th. It's coming out around here, and that should be interesting. It's not the same as Golda's Balcony, which was the play that was on all over the country, on Broadway. But this one is called. That was a one-woman show. This has got several characters in it, Diane, and this one and that one. So it should be interesting.
Sai.
You mentioned the pursuit of justice, indicating that we haven't really found it yet. And does that mean that different people have different ideas of what justice is?
Marcia, response?
So I'm listening to Sai, so I'm thinking, so you're saying, Sai, that justice is subjective.
Right.
Everybody's view of what the outcome is, it's going to depend on.
But in this country, justice prevails so that we know supposedly what justice is.
I wasn't thinking that when I made my comment earlier. I was thinking that it's just hard to get justice because, there's Hyminia. There's just, you saw that in the case of Johnny Depp. If it wasn't for the fact that he was so rich, he would have lost a case he should have won because, sometimes things just don't appear the way they are. So, and there's just lots of reasons why it's hard to get justice. But then Sai's point is different, and that is that, maybe we don't agree on what justice is. And that, I think, is definitely part of the divide in America and in Israel, between people that see justice in one way and people that see it in a very different way. What is justice? Richard, do you want to respond to that?
Well, to me, justice is very subjective. If you just look at the Supreme Court decisions last year about abortion, you can see their justification is different than the justification for those individuals who approved it 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. So it's justice is within the society. That's my feeling. I mean, it's not an absolute. Is anybody here a lawyer? No.
Leonard Mandel, who was at the adult ed meeting, he's a lawyer.
Not in the room, though.
Leonard acts as if we're in a prosecution trial. I tell Leonard, I say, afterwards, Leonard, we're not in a deposition. But yeah, I think law is really subjective. And when I read this, I realized even more about you should do justice. But how do you do justice? What's the proper way of doing justice? What does it mean?
It's societal.
They try to explain it, but it's still very nebulous. And every society has to define what they mean by justice.
Yeah, it's societally subjective. Depending.
Yes, when you think of China, where they will have their own form of justice, or Russia, what we would think as a travesty, they think is the law or a form of justice. So again, I think it is very subjective, subject to the particular culture and its rules and its mores.
In Iran, they've arrested a couple of hundred Iranian journalists for reporting on the protests against the government. So these are journalists. That's their job, is to report what's going on. They weren't political activists. And even the idea of being a political activist in most Western countries, as long as you're not violent, then then you have a constitutional right to protest a government decision or just the government in general. But not in Iran. They view that as a crime. And in contrast here, there were people that were very violent. There was two lawyers that they threw a petrol bomb at a police car, and they got arrested. But their charges have been reduced now 3 times. Because it's seen, since nobody was hurt, even though it was potentially dangerous, there's there's sympathy for them. So there's different views on what's fair, what's reasonable, what's just. Evelyn and then Richard.
No, I was just thinking that many of the, the laws that were decreed at the time are still valid today in our particular culture in terms of what is considered just or unjust. And as I went through the section, I was just astonished at what was considered a fair verdict. But what astonished me was that even then, if the locals could not determine to make a declaration of justice for a particular case, that they had already conceived of higher courts and the concept of a higher court at that time. It seems to me that this was sophisticated in terms of thinking of the law and the fact that perhaps the locals could not validly determine what was just, and they needed someone perhaps more learned, or yes, it would have to be someone more learned in the concept of law to be able. So here we have our local laws, we have district laws, we have federal laws, and then we have the Supreme Court, and these are all steps upward. And if a case cannot be resolved locally, then it just keeps going higher and higher until it gets to the Supreme Court. And I think this concept was established at this time. So,
Richard.
Well, you got to remember that when Justice and Justice was written, we're talking about what, 3,000. Well, Deuteronomy is 660 BC. Okay, 2,800 years ago, 2,700 years ago. There were kings. There were monarchies. There was not such a thing as democracy. And democracy actually was a new concept developed in Europe in what, the 15th, 14th century, 13th century, and in England. So Iran, for instance, is not a just country because it's a it's a theocratic dictatorship, whereas almost all of Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Europe and are democracies now, or some of them are illiberal democracies, but still democracies. And we in the United States are a democracy. So I think the way we treat justice here and the way they treat justice in Russia, in China, in Myanmar, in Venezuela are different than the way we treat justice here in a democracy.
Right, and that difference is quite extreme. I have here something interesting just to show you. This is Rediscovering Philo of Alexandria by Rabbi Michael Leo Samuel. And he's a rabbi in San Diego. And I called him about 2 weeks ago. And he's got this is a series on Philo of Alexandria. This is supposedly a picture of him. Philo of Alexandria lived in the 1st century and was a Greek Jewish thinker. His works were preserved by the church, not by Jews. And so what Rabbi Samuel has done is taken Philo's writings and broken it up by the Parsha, which is not the way that Philo wrote it. So Philo has a lot of books, but they're not by Parsha. But this guy went through all of Philo's work and put it in by the Parsha. But I just want to read a little bit about how Philo puts it according to Rabbi Samuel. So he says in chapter 16, verse 20, Philo translates it as follows. How do we translate it? That expression?
I'm not sure what
justice, you mean?
Yes. How do we translate it? What is the exact phraseology we use?
Justice shall pursue. Okay.
Good. So the way Philo translates is justice and only justice you shall pursue. Justice and only justice shall you pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And Philo comments, therefore, Moses gives us a very instructive command. Remember that the book of Deuteronomy is basically a number of final sermons or speeches that Moses gave before he's going to die. Therefore, Moses gives us a very instructive command. He bids us to pursue justice, quote unquote, justly. And by implication, we may infer that it is possible to pursue justice unjustly. By this expression, Moses is referring to anyone who renders a just reward for the pecuniary gain, not only in the courts of law, but everywhere on land and sea, and one may almost say in all affairs of life.
Is that bribery he's talking about?
Yes. So Moses is referring to anyone who renders a just reward for pecuniary gain.
Pecuniary.
So,
pecuniary is
pecuniary.
Yeah, sorry. So you can pursue justice unjustly. So this is saying, I think, that do the ends justify the means? know that you have to pursue justice in a just way. So let's say I know that Pam is guilty of something, and I'm going to frame her, but I know that I'm not really framing her for something she didn't do. I know she did it, but I can't manufacture evidence to get a just end. That's not, you have to pursue justice justly.
Independent of anything you would receive from it. Yeah.
I'll take your case, Pam. I'll take your case.
Cy?
When I was a kid, I remember.
I just need a good Jewish lawyer.
And we used to watch Western serials. And I used to love it when they committed Western justice. Western justice was different than Eastern justice. And Eastern justice was different than Southern justice. So what does it all mean? What is it?
Well,
the South had a whole different concept of justice.
Yes, well, when I was in Miami many, many years ago, I had an Israeli taxi driver, and he told me that in 1962, he and a friend just arrived in the US, and they bought an old car, and they drove throughout the country, and they were driving through Mississippi, and they got pulled over by a traffic cop. And he said, follow me to the police station. And there they emptied their pockets of all their wallets and everything. And they took them into this little courtyard in the back. They handcuffed them behind the back. And the cop pulled out a rifle and pointed it at them and said, I'm going to just kill them right now. And then we're going to keep their money. And the police chief came out and he said, don't do that. Just send them on their way. So they uncuffed them and they gave them back their driver's license. They kept everything else and they gave them the car keys and they said, boys, drive and don't stop until you cross the state line. And they ran and they lost several $100s, but they were just very happy to get. And then I realized this is what they were doing to make money and keep themselves entertained. They would take anybody who looked like they were traveling through, and so this was Southern justice at the time.
Right.
Evelyn.
I guess the early 1939, 40, my sister married a Southerner and lived in Hickory, North Carolina. And this was before I-95 was the main road. Used to be the Boston Post Road that went all the way down, US 1, but then they built I-95. However, before 95 was built, when you went down south, people from New York used to go to Florida, but they had to drive in those days. And they were forced to go through these southern towns. And if you went through the town, it was posted, speed limit 5 miles an hour. And if you went 1 mile over 5 miles, there was a policeman waiting to pull you in and to fine you very heftily. And this is how the local police managed to sustain their police department by catching all of the Northerners going through trying to get to Florida. And everyone was mightily relieved when I-95 came in and they could just zip right down and were not forced to go through these little towns that they knew they were going to absolutely get robbed. There was no way about it. So, yes, that was Southern justice.
There are always speed traps. I've seen it up in New Hampshire and everywhere. I mean, they all do that when you get into a little town. But Rabbi, you were mentioning that you were in a cab. And you were mentioning last week that you were in a cab in Israel and you were talking to the cabbie. I think you should write a book, Things I Have Learned from Cab Drivers.
Okay, let's take a look at the Harvey Fields' comments. Page 139 at the bottom of the page on the left. Minya, would you be willing to read? Okay. Perek Aleph, justice, justice shall you pursue.
The pursuit of justice is one of the most frequently repeated concerns not only of the Torah, but of Jewish tradition. The Israelites are commanded to use just weights and honest measures in their business dealings, and to hear and decide justly in disputes between any persons, Israelites or strangers. They are forbidden to take bribes or to favor persons in judgment because they are rich or poor. Society is to pursue justice in dealing with social, political, and international matters. The prophet Amos declares in the name of God, "Let justice well up as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream." Isaiah proclaims, "Seek justice, relieve the oppressed." The psalmist poses the question, who is worthy to dwell in God's sanctuary? And answers, those who live without blame, act justly, acknowledge the truth, do not slander others, harm others, hold grudges against their neighbors. The mother of Lemuel, king of Massa, advises her son, speak up for those who are silent, for the rights of the unfortunate. Speak out, judge justly, champion the poor and the needy. The emphasis of the biblical tradition upon the pursuit of justice influences later rabbinic teachers as well. Commenting on our Torah portion's command to appoint judges and for those judges to pursue justice, Rabbi Simeon ben Gamaliel.
Gamliel.
Gamaliel?
It's Gamliel.
Gamliel. Forget the other A, I guess. Who served as president of the Sanhedrin in the middle of the 1st century CE, warns his generation, do not ridicule or scorn the doing of justice, for it is one of the foundations of the world. For the world is balanced on 3 things, on justice, on truth, and on peace.
Okay, thank you. And you see the sources for that. Deuteronomy Rabbah is one of the Midrashim, the rabbinic Midrashim. And Avot is part of the Mishnah, which is the ethics of the sages. So these are, and apparently he's quoted and saying the same thing in both of these places. But these are 2 of the rabbinic writings that are not the Talmud exactly, but they're sort of connected to it. Yes, Evelyn.
The concept of justice has to be based on law. The law has to come before you can administer justice. And so that was not mentioned. And why wasn't it?
I think it's seen as a separate value that transcends law somehow. I don't know. That's a good point. Sai, do you have any comment on that? Why doesn't law seem to precede this concept of justice?
I personally think that the justice and the law are 2 separate and individual things. For example, the law says you're not supposed to cross the street on a green light, but what's that got to do with justice? And so forth and so on. I think that the relationship, justice is the relationship between people on an individual basis, rather than having laws that define justice.
Okay, Marcia.
There are basic things tenets that are law. The 10 Commandments are law.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And, thou shalt not kill. So there we have one of the first laws, and that we had it. And so I think that's a statute that can't cross against the light. That's different than a law, which is a basic
law of
nature, if
we're
you will.
a nation of laws. We're a nation of laws.
So you can have justice. You have to know what is right, what you may do, and what you may not do. Otherwise, how can you administer
justice?
Nothing
to do with justice. Nothing to do with justice.
Well, I don't understand. Please say that again. I'm sorry.
No, I said we're a nation of laws, which is not based necessarily on justice. The laws are not necessarily based on justice, is what I'm saying. For example, it used to be that you couldn't vote. You know that unless you own property. Women couldn't vote. There's thousands of things that go on now that is the law, but which are unjust. But it's the law.
But then to get
Richard.
Okay, I'm cheating. I went to the internet. The difference between law and justice is that law is a body of rules and standards issued by a government or a social institution to govern behavior. So law governs behavior. Justice is a concept that is based on equality, fairness, and morality that is the basis of the law system. Law defines what is right and wrong, while justice also considers the circumstances and the outcome of the right and the wrong. I think that's a very good explanation.
But in ancient Judaism, there was no absolute equality. There were the Kohanim, the Leviim, and the Israelites. These were different. Now, there wasn't a sense that the Israelites were inferior, but it wasn't equal. Different groups had different rights and responsibilities. So there was not a totally egalitarian society. Men and women were treated differently. Citizens and foreigners were treated differently. So, you can see the limitations here. Pam, comments? Okay, she's still worried about getting framed for something that she did do. Shirley, comment? You're the only one now still living in the South. So we'll see if you have any comments about justice. Okay, let's move on. Back to you, Minya.
Other rabbinic commentators claim that the guarantee of justice in the courts and in all dealings between human beings is more important than all the sacrifices offered at the temple in Jerusalem. Justifying their view, they quote a verse from Proverbs which declares, "To do righteousness and justice is more desired by God than sacrifices." The rabbis maintained that sacrifices had value during the limited historical period of the temple. By contrast, the doing of justice is always crucial to society's welfare. Continue in the box.
This is Eliezer Berkowitz. He was an Orthodox rabbi in Chicago. Who's from Illinois here? Raise your hand. Illinois, only one. And who's from Chicago? Nobody. Oh, well, you're from there. But Richard hasn't lived in Chicago for a long time.
40 years.
How many years?
50.
50. So when he left Chicago was when Al Capone was still running around.
Mayor Daley won.
Always.
Always, right.
So let's read that. Yes, Minya.
To seek justice. To seek justice is to relieve the oppressed. But how else are the oppressed to be relieved if not by judging the oppressor and crushing the ability to oppress? History is not a Sunday school where the question is to forgive or not to forgive. The toleration of injustice is the toleration of human suffering. Since the proud and the mighty who inflict the suffering do not, as a rule, yield to moral persuasion, responsibility for the sufferer demands that justice be done so that oppression be ended.
Wow, this is pretty radical, isn't this? What does the Berkowitz seem to be saying? Marcia, Cy, or Richard?
He's saying if you're being oppressed, you should rise up against the oppressor.
Right.
Wow. So that's what people like the progressives, like Ocasio-Cortez, that's what they want to do. They want to rise up and they want to change things, and they don't care that they're going to knock whatever's out. So according to Eliezer Berkowitz, what they're doing is perfectly justifiable for people that kind of like the system we have. Then we view that as radically attacking civilization. But from their point of view, they're simply trying to get relief for the oppressed. Cy and then Steve.
You know, the left hand really doesn't believe the right hand. In Israel, as we all know, if you're Orthodox, you don't want to send your son to the army. And so who goes to the army? Now, is that justice?
No.
Is that justice?
I mean, it's all from your perspective, I guess.
Right.
You know, as you know, they feel, they actually believe their theology is that what keeps Israel alive is the relationship between the children of Israel and God. And what keeps that relationship strong is the study of Talmud. So if they can get all their young men to study Talmud all day, that does more for the preservation of the state of Israel than the people in the army. They really believe that. They take that seriously. What? I'm sorry, Cy?
No, in our definition of justice, is that just?
Okay, Steve?
Well, I mean, considering the fact the civil rights movement, that was justice for their time, and it was the right time for them to create this movement, to create justice for themselves.
So there were laws that said that Blacks could not do certain things, could not go certain places, could not drink water out of certain water fountains. These were the laws, but the laws were seen by the civil rights leaders as unjust. And they had, so this is what Berkowitz is clearly saying, is that to seek justice is to relieve the oppressed. And you can't expect the oppressor to voluntarily, see reason. So you go to the people, the legislator at the time, and you say it's not reasonable, to use the term that's now being fought over in Israel, reasonableness. It's not reasonable to have a law that doesn't let a Black person drink out of the same water fountain as a white person. This is discriminatory. It's not just. And it leads to a lot of other things that are much worse. And the people that made those laws, according to Berkowitz, you can't expect them to yield to moral persuasion. If they were sensitive to that, they wouldn't have passed those kind of laws in the first place. Pam, and then Minya, and then Marcia.
Well, I think the message is we shouldn't have to wait till the victims of injustice rise up. We should look for the injustice and, take care of it early in the game.
Okay. Minya?
I just want to go back to Israel for a minute. Do the Orthodox understand that they live in the middle of a part of the world where everybody's their enemy? And if everyone's studying the Torah, who's supposed to protect them from these enemies? If there's no army, no reservists?
Well, I think they want the non-Orthodox to do all that work. They feel that since they're not going to study Torah, those people can do that.
That's unjust.
Well, from your point of view.
Of the chosen.
It's from your point of view, from the ultra-Orthodox point of view, the law is unjust in Israel because it's not taking them in consideration. So again, we see the morality and the ethics of different societies within the same country.
Right, and they see that if Russian immigrants set up a store that sells pork chops, that their job is to close down that store.
Right.
Even though that store is just selling it to people that want pork chops, and the pork chops are labeled pork chops, not kosher, and they're not selling to anyone under any false pretenses, it's still something that they should stop. That Orthodox bus drivers in Israel, there's been several incidences, were telling women, cover up. You don't have a shirt, a shirt with sleeves on.
Yep.
You know, cover up. This is one bus driver said this is a Jewish country. You can't wear whatever kind of a shirt.
Really?
I mean, yeah, there's
And you
been
have
a
to sit in
number.
the back.
Well,
And you have to sit
I
in the back of the
remember
bus.
back in Budapest at the big synagogue in Budapest that they have there. We were told beforehand that no shorts. You know, the women cannot wear shorts things. Men can't wear shorts.
Marcia?
That's true when you go to the wall in Jerusalem, but they tell you you can't approach, go down that, you know, to pray at the wall with that. They give you a schmutter thing around your waist if you're a woman or whatever. It happened on our trip when we went with the temple. So, but you can see that that's a place of prayer. To see it on a bus, on a city bus, is different than going into a house of worship and being expected to dress appropriately, you know?
Right. So on a bus, you're on a public bus.
Yeah.
It's different than going into a synagogue in Budapest, right? You know,
But
I mean,
the bus driver doesn't see that difference in justice because he says, I'm in Israel. This is Israel. And you have to conform to my religious expectations, not yours. That's what he's saying. And so is it really justice what he's doing versus a religious dogmatism? That's something that, say, the Supreme Court or the Supreme Court of Israel, since it has no constitution, will have to say what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. And that's the whole problem right now is the Knesset wants to, or the government wants to redefine what is considered reasonable.
And let me put in a plug here for one of our 2 courses in October is Reform Judaism. The other one is Israel in Crisis. So bring your friends and sign up for Israel in Crisis. We'll be talking about this. And that'll be in October. So by then, I'm sure there'll be some new developments. And I've already told the board that if Israel wants me to be prime minister temporarily, I'm going to take a leave of absence from my job here. So
we'll have fun.
It's it's becoming increasingly likely they're going to make me an offer. Okay, Minya, back to you. We're at the very bottom of page 140 on the left.
Rabbi Nachman offers an example of the importance of justice within society by singling out the accomplishments of King David. He judged others justly, acquitting the blameless and condemning the guilty, making the robber restore his stolen property. As a result, the kingdom he built was a strong and secure one. People trusted one another and lived in cooperation and peace. This emphasis upon justice within Jewish society is particularly evident within the early biblical and rabbinical judicial systems. Parsha Shoftim,
which means judges.
Which begins with Moses commanding the people to appoint judges and clerks for your tribes in all your settlements. Elders are to appoint judges for these courts and give them power to carry out hearings, trials, and judgments. If they, for any reason, cannot reach a decision, the case is to be turned over to a higher court of priests. Rabbi Judah Hanasi, author of the Mishnah, provides a description of the courts and cases before them. Each city had its local bet din, or house of justice, comprised of 3 or 7 judges with 2 Levitical attendants. In Jerusalem, there was a small Sanhedrin of 23 judges and a great Sanhedrin, which was not only the final arbiter of the law, but also responsible for determining the religious calendar and defining matters of religious tradition. The great Sanhedrin was comprised of 71 members, a number chosen because of God's command to Moses to choose 70 elders to help him with the leadership of the people. Adding Moses to the 70, the rabbis held that the Great Sanhedrin should have a total of 71 members. Rabbi Judah describes the work of each of these courts. The local Bet Din dealt with cases of property and personal injury. The small Sanhedrin adjudicated criminal and capital cases. The Great Sanhedrin heard all exceptional matters and resolved those cases sent to it by the lower courts. The system of justice also included regulations for appointing judges, examining witnesses, and hearing and deciding cases. Excluded from acting as judges were relatives, dice players, those who loaned money on interest, pigeon flyers, and those who sold produce grown during the sabbatical year. Relatives were also forbidden from serving as witnesses. Witnesses were to be examined one at a time without hearing the testimony of others, so the court could compare their reports and reach a just decision.
Okay, stop there for the moment. And this is why when I did the wedding last Sunday, was anyone there? Any poll holders? Okay, so we had 4 volunteer poll holders from the temple. And it was, were you there for the blessing? When we blessed, he was Portuguese, he's Brazilian, so he spoke Portuguese. So it was my first wedding conducted partly in Portuguese. And there's several letters that sound very different than Spanish. And so I had to practice. And I did well until this one of the words at the very end of what I said in Spanish. And the husband looked at me like, what? What are you saying? And the wife whispered into his ear, the rabbi's trying to say. And but the ketubah cannot be signed by relatives because this is part of the law here of witnessing. You can't have relatives sign as witnesses because they're obviously not objective. You know, and even though you may be a friend, you're more objective than an actual relative, probably, right? So, and you can easily see that in the laws of inheritance in a case of a will. If you're a friend, you know, you're probably not inheriting. So even though you're a friend, you're much more neutral than a relative who either is inheriting or wants to inherit. And so you can see that that would be true. Other comments on what we've read? Pam, and then Marcia, then Minya, and then Evelyn.
I have a question about the exclusion of who can be judges. Some of them make sense to me. One of them doesn't is pigeon flyers.
Yes, I was just going to ask that.
Well, didn't they put messages from one place to
Well,
another?
spying. If they were spying, they would use the pigeons to fly from one place to the next with secret messages, which could conceivably, really, in a sense, abort the justice of whatever is being tried at that.
Not to be spying, it's just information going from one to another. That's, you know, yeah.
This was what? A primitive form of a drone.
That's true.
And never trust a banker.
The original email, okay? So,
Okay. Well, that was interesting.
Yes. So pigeon flyers are not to be trusted. But dice players, you can understand?
Yeah. Gambling.
I have a question.
Yes, whoever was next. Yeah.
I think I was next. So the question is this on a Babylonian model? Because a lot of times the Jewish laws or structure of society comes from Babylonian models. And I'm wondering.
Correct. I mean, there were two Gemaras written, you know, that formed the basis of the Talmud. One was, and the major one was in Babylonian.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah, because I see so much that, you know, if you go look at Babylonian law, so I'm not a Babylonian law expert, but it seems to reflect, you know, no, it wasn't totally original, is what I'm saying.
And no bankers allowed.
Minya and then Evelyn.
Is the Bet Din where you went for a divorce?
Yes.
So it would be a panel of Orthodox judges?
Rabbi.
Three Dayanim. That's a form of an Orthodox rabbi who's an expert on this. Yes.
Okay, that's where my sister had to do that when she wanted a divorce. She had to go before, I guess, the bed.
This is where?
New Jersey.
So she didn't have to, she wanted to.
She wanted it to be so that if she got married again, there would be no question that she got a legitimate divorce.
All right, so in Orthodoxy, there's a big issue with mamzerut or bastardry. So if you're not properly divorced and you remarry and have children, your children would be considered mamzerim. And so Minya's sister presumably wanted to avoid this problem. So therefore, it's not so much a problem how you get married, it's how you get divorced.
Right.
Yeah.
Evelyn and then Cy.
I have a question about those who loaned money on interest. In the Middle Ages, Christians were not allowed to be charged interest by their own Christians. And so they went to the Jewish money lenders who were permitted to charge interest. And yet here, it was obviously obvious that there were Jews then who did charge interest at that point. Was it the fact that Jews in the Middle Ages were not permitted to own land and so were seriously limited in ways that they could make money, that they did turn to charging interest, as opposed to what happened in earlier eras?
Well, Jews are not allowed to charge interest from other Jews.
Really?
But they can charge to outsiders. Yeah.
Right.
In other words, those that were charging interest in this biblical period then were charging others interest. Is that it?
Right, and there was less of that. But in the Middle Ages, you had very small Jewish communities living among mostly Christians, so they could charge interest. You know, the people that would want to borrow would be the Christians. So that was a good business. Whereas in Israel, there was the people that might want to borrow were mostly Jews. So that wouldn't work.
Weren't there usury laws?
When and where?
From Jews loaning to Jews.
That there was, you could loan, but you couldn't charge interest.
And why would you loan?
Then you're right, you wouldn't loan, right?
Very good, Marge.
Right, so, but you could loan. You know, that's, so yes. So,
then this kind of comes to a halt because then it's not profitable.
yes, not profitable at all.
Cy has his hand up.
Yes, Cy.
Was this a period when they were still wandering in the desert?
No, I mean, it's kind of not totally clear what period it is, but it's presumably once the Israelites are already settled in their land.
So they could have had various kingdoms at that time.
Various kingdoms?
Yes.
In what sense kingdoms?
Well, you know, there was a kingdom of Israel, there was a kingdom of Judea, and so forth and so on. There were various kingdoms within Judaism. And this is what I'm getting at, where they were able to pick up a lot of information from the various other civilizations around them, which they incorporated. So here we're talking about the Jews. And, you know, what does that mean? Wherever they lived, did they live in Europe? Did they live in Asia? Where did they live at this particular point in time? Because to me, it makes a big difference when you're talking about building rules and regulations and laws in 1400 versus 2000 BC or something like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Sai. Richard, Shirley, comments?
Yeah, it's undefined, but I would assume this just took place at the time of the giving of the Torah. That would be my assumption. And I would assume that all these laws evolved not in vacuum, but from the surrounding society that the Jews were in. That would be my assumption.
Yeah, it does say, if you go way up to that top paragraph on the right, it says Moses begins with Moses commanding the people to appoint judges and clerks. So the structure of the court per se is set up at the time of Moses. It's saying here.
Okay.
Right?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Pam?
Disagree with Marcia because they say Moses is the 70th person.
Right. So, yeah, 71st person.
71st person.
Right. Which is a good number because it's a prime number, and so you have a balance of impartial. You're never gonna get a 50-50 vote, right? Can't divide 71 by 2.
Okay. Shirley, comment? Okay. Minya, you want to read more?
She's muted.
Got unmute. Yeah, sorry.
Non-capital cases.
Could Marcia or Pam tell me where the number 71 was?
Right-hand column, page 140, and here, the bottom of the last sentence of the second paragraph that says starts Ruba Judah Hanasi, that go down to the end of that paragraph. Adding Moses to the 70, the rabbis held that the great Sanhedrin should have a total of 71 members.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And earlier it mentioned, as you said, Moses, it derives from Moses, or selecting the judges.
Yes, and last week I talked about how the selection of the judges is presented differently in Deuteronomy than it was in Exodus. In Exodus, it was the Jethro who suggested it, and Jethro and Moses just decide on it and institute it, and then they inform the Israelites, this is your new system, we got judges. In Deuteronomy, it's seen as Moses's idea alone, but Moses goes to the Israelites and says, you nominate people, and then I'll induct them, do a ceremony. So it's much more democratic. The nominations of the judges come from the people. They're not simply selected by Moses. So whereas Exodus is much more of a autocratic system, Deuteronomy is much more democratic. Marcia.
Jethro, his father-in-law?
Jethro's his father-in-law, that's Zipporah's father, and he's a Midianite priest. He's not Jewish, and he's a priest for a different religion. The two religions are apparently quite close, similar, but it's not the same. So Moses is intermarried, and he marries a daughter of a priest. So just so you can see that things have not changed that much in 3,000 years. Marcia.
I remember that Rabbi Moss was telling us that Moses was swamped by all the detail and stuff he had, his functionary stuff that he had to do in the community. And his father-in-law said, you have to delegate. I guess he went to Harvard Law School and management courses. And so he told him that he had to get this set up so he isn't handling everything one-on-one.
Yes. So yes, Pam.
It's ironic since, when I was dating Yeshiva boy, I was encouraged to convert, But, here Moses says, oh, don't worry about it.
Well, we don't know that for sure, necessarily. There's not that much information. I would imagine Zipporah came under a fair amount of pressure from various people. And even after all of her dedication to Judaism was demonstrated, Moses' brother and sister didn't like her. Whether it was because she was a daughter of Midian priest. Also, there's a thing that says she's a Cushite, meaning she's black. So maybe they didn't like that he married a black woman, so maybe there was other
Black,
issues.
not Jewish girl, worse than you, Pam, see?
And maybe there were other issues that weren't necessarily connected to either of those things, because Zipporah, may have been just taking positions they didn't like or behaving in ways they didn't like. I don't know. It doesn't say what's causing them to not like Zipporah.
It begs the question, were there Black Jews in the Israelite community? That we know?
I wasn't there. I can't tell you.
I just wondered if it was discussed at any point during the Bible.
Well, kind of because of this Cushite comment, she's definitely identified as a Cushite. So some people might interpret that to mean that she was Black. It's not for sure. It's an interesting subtopic is how the Southern ministers interpreted this whole biblical thing in terms of slavery before the Civil War, and some ministers justified it. In the Jewish community, it was interesting. The main rabbi supporting slavery was not from the South. He was from New York. He was an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Raphael. And he wrote a big essay, didn't talk specifically about Southern slavery, but he supported the institution of slavery in the Bible. And everybody interpreted that as he was indirectly supporting Southern slavery. Of course, there was a lot of business done between New York and the South. So his congregants, many of them had economic interests in maintaining slavery, even though New York, of course, was a free state. On contrary, Rabbi Einhorn, who was a Reform rabbi, was in Baltimore. Maryland was technically a free state, but very close to the South. And he gave a sermon attacking slavery. And his congregants came to him and said, we booked you a flight on Delta leaving midnight from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and we're going to make sure you're on it because otherwise they may lynch you. And so he had to leave, and he became a rabbi in Philadelphia or New York instead of Baltimore because of his positions made it untenable for him to stay in New York. So this is a question that relates to justice. These were laws, slavery was legal. And so what do you do when your sense of what is right conflicts with what is legal, right? What is legal, right? So I may not like a law. I mean, there were laws against all sorts of things, right? That there still are. So there are laws that I think we can all agree is bad, right? So there's a law, do not murder, like that's a 10 commandment, and it's also a law, right? So, and it's also something we can agree that going up and shooting somebody in the supermarket should be illegal, and you need to punish this person. You need to take them off the street because if not, they'll shoot more people in supermarkets all across the country. But then there's laws that don't make so much sense. And then there's laws the police are told do not enforce. That's a really weird one, right? Where you still have a law on the books, like marijuana. And at certain places recently, before it became legal, the police said, we're not going to waste police resources on enforcing this law. Even though it's a law you're caught with quote unquote a recreational amount of marijuana, it's illegal. You should get arrested. But we're not going to arrest them unless there's some other serious second law being violated. So if you shoot somebody in the supermarket and you have marijuana on you, we'll arrest you for both things. But if you're just carrying a little bit of marijuana, we're not going to bother you, even though it's a law.
It was in Massachusetts when I was there. Seatbelt law was a secondary violation. You only got charged with that if you did something else also, because it just wasn't worth pulling over cars to see if you were wearing your seatbelt or not, you know.
Well, and I think I told you when I was in Israel, they just passed a seatbelt law, and they had a roadblock to make sure everyone had their seatbelt on. And the cop saw from a distance I wasn't wearing my seatbelt, so I quickly put it on. And when he came close to me, I pretended I didn't know any Hebrew, and I said, "I'm visiting here, and I'm from America." And then he points to the seatbelt and he says in English, "Were you wearing your?" And he didn't know the word in English for seatbelt, so then he said chagura. And I nod my head, yes, I was wearing it. He says, it's not nice to lie, even somebody who's new in the country. But apparently the law was that because he'd only seen it from a distance, he couldn't ticket me based on what he observed. He had to get my confession. So because the first time I got pulled over for speeding in Connecticut, I just a little bit when there was a downhill. So I told the judge that, and I expected them to be sympathetic, but they weren't. As soon as I confessed, they gave me a hefty ticket, even though there were extenuating circumstances. So I learned the hard way. You can't always be too honest, right? But that's not good, because you want in a court of law people to be encouraged to be completely honest. And I'd always learned from my parents, be honest, and you'll be rewarded for being honest. And so I was shocked when the legal system in Connecticut did not reward me for being honest.
Sorry.
Yes. It's a harsh life, and you have to learn how to maneuver it. And sometimes you have to lie a little bit. Steve.
No.
Just stretching.
Shirley, Pam, Richard. Okay, Minya, you want to keep reading, or you want to pass it on to somebody else?
Well, if there's someone who wants to pick up, that's fine.
Is there anyone who'll pick up for Minya?
Let's see,
Marcia?
where are we?
Well, then I can. We're in non-capital cases.
It's the very, very last line on page 140 in the bottom right.
Oh,
I'll do it.
go ahead.
Okay, Evelyn.
In non-capital cases, representatives were permitted to present arguments for dismissal or conviction in any order. In capital cases, however, the court first heard arguments for acquittal and then for conviction. The eldest judges were required to declare their opinions first when discussing a non-capital case. In capital cases, the youngest were required to speak first so that their opinions would not be influenced by the older judges. A simple majority determined the verdict in non-capital cases. In capital cases, a majority of 1 was sufficient for acquittal, but a majority of 2 was necessary for conviction. A higher court could reverse the decision of a lower court on non-capital matters, but in capital cases, a higher court could only reverse a case from conviction to acquittal. Finally, the verdict on a non-capital case could be rendered on the same day as the hearing. In capital cases, if the verdict was acquittal, it could also be given on the same day. But if the court decision was conviction, the announcement could be made only the next day. Trials were never permitted on Shabbat or on festivals. Clearly, the issue of fair treatment in all cases was central to the Jewish court system of justice. Biased testimony and influence of one judge on another were to be avoided to guarantee fair trials. Decisions seemed to tilt toward acquittal and dismissal rather than conviction.
Okay, thank you, Evelyn. So yes, Marcia.
So I'm realizing as we're reading this is all predates jury trials. Yeah. This is all by judges, and so it's not by a panel of your peers, basically.
I don't know if that's a biblical idea at all.
Jury trials.
Right. I'm not an expert on this, but I don't recall reading about jury trials in the Bible at all. But that doesn't mean, I mean, why do you think jury trials are superior to have judges? I mean, I'd rather have judges who are experts than to have these 12 average people who are very easily influenced by unrelated issues.
You're probably right, yeah.
I mean, if I was trying to get acquittal and I was guilty and I had a good lawyer, I'd want a jury.
Unless you got a hanging judge, as they say, you know, he's known for being very strict, you know.
Yeah.
Why did the conviction push it off a day? I didn't understand that.
You don't want to have the trial and then have the judge announced 10 minutes later, we're executing this person. You want to force them to think about it for a long time.
So if you knew it, so if they said it was the next day, you knew already that it was going to be a conviction.
Well, no, you could think about it longer and still acquit. But let's say the trial ends and it's obvious it's an acquittal. The judges can say it's acquitted. If it's not sure, or if let's say the judges meet after the trial ends and they says, we're gonna hang this guy. Then they have to think about it. Maybe overnight, they'll wake up in the middle of the night with a crisis of conscience and they'll say, maybe he's not guilty. What did that witness say? That they were in the supermarket and they saw another person with a gun and we forgot about that. So you have to give it a little time on the hope that it might get the judges to think a little more and hopefully deliberate more. Hopefully they'll have another session. They'll spend another couple hours going through the evidence. Before you're going to execute somebody, you want them to think about it a lot. Sai.
I'm just wondering, is this applicable to the known kingdoms of David and other known Jewish kings? This kind of a system of justice, if you will. I mean, these were organized institutions which would have a set of laws, but I can't imagine this being something that they had wandering through the desert, you know, for 40 years. Anything like this? Are you aware of anything, Rabbi?
I mean, I think this was written much later. I think that, you know, maybe it's put back into the words of something that was said in the desert, but I don't think this developed until much later. Evelyn.
I remember stories that told that King David and King Solomon particularly judged different cases. Did this system exist during the temple period? Was there a conflict there? Did the king have the final say? The two don't seem to hang together.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a good question. You and Sai are both asking good questions I can't answer. This is from the Talmud, which is more than 1,000 years later. How much of it was present earlier, I can't even begin to tell you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, well.
Again, it makes us question so many things that we read about, and unfortunately puts doubt in my mind, at any rate, as to the veracity of so much that we're reading.
And this is about, this field is the development of Jewish law. When did different laws develop? What in the Bible is consistent with what's in the Talmud later and what's not? And this is a whole area that I kind of deliberately never, went into because I was doing other things. So but I've got in my office quite a few books on Jewish law. Menachem alone has a 4-volume, and I could probably, do some research if we wanted to go into this more in depth. Pam, Richard, Minya, Shirley, comments. Steve? Okay. Let's read a little bit more and then we'll conclude. Evelyn?
Commenting on the Torah's command to appoint judges who will promote justice, the Sifra emphasizes the importance of appointing judges with expert knowledge of the halacha or law, and with the records of unquestionable integrity, honesty, and righteous behavior. Rashi notes that dispensing justice means not accepting bribes and never showing favor or preferential treatment to witnesses or those seeking judgment before the court. Several commentators ask the question, why does Moses repeat the word tzedek, or justice, in his statement? Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that Adonai your God is giving you. Pointing out that the commandment could stand without the repetition, since the Torah does not often repeat words, interpreters offer a number of explanations. Some modern scholars suggest that the repetition is simply a way in which the ancient text forms an exclamation point or emphasizes an idea. By repeating the word tzedek, Moses underscores the importance of pursuing justice as a means of community survival. Others argue that the term is repeated to convey the idea that the pursuit of justice is not only the responsibility of government, of judges within society, but also a mitzvah, an imperative for each individual. One may not say, let the courts worry about right and wrong or justice and injustice. I will remain silent.
Okay. So this is a classic hermeneutical interpretation. Hermeneutics is how do you interpret things? So here you've got a very unusual expression. Justice, justice shall you pursue. Tzedek, tzedek terdov. Obviously, it's rhetorical. Why would you repeat the same word twice? There's no need. So therefore, you can interpret it almost in any way you want, right? When you repeat it twice, maybe it's just to emphasize. Justice is really important. I'm going to say it twice. Justice is really important. I'm going to say it twice, and so forth. But maybe it means something specific. So it's up to the commentator to try to flesh out what that meaning might be. Okay, some final comments. Justice, did we learn anything useful about justice? Does the Jewish view of justice that we talked about or that we have not talked about seem to be something we're proud of? Final comments. Steve, Richard, Pam. Pam and then Richard.
I think we should be proud. The Jews should be proud that we put such an emphasis on justice.
Okay. Good. And you like the way that justice is portrayed in these writings, more or less. Okay. So, okay, Richard, and then Cy, Marcia, Steve.
Well, I agree with Pam exactly. I mean, this is probably some of the oldest justice there was, although there was older things that we see in the tablets. What, Hammurabi, from Babylonian?
Hammurabi.
Hammurabi have laws, and so these are probably based on those those other laws. I mean, nothing's in a vacuum.
Okay. Steve? Marcia? Steve?
And again, we have a social action committee in our temple that helps, feed the homeless and stuff like that. But it's always been from my understanding, a reform prospect of what justice should be, and the Jews should abide by.
So do you see a social action committee as trying to fulfill this pasuk, tzedek tirdof?
Absolutely, yes.
So tzedek tirdof, justice you pursue, is not strictly a legal thing for lawyers. The social action committee is not a legal group. We're not trying to change the laws. We're trying just to help. And the food bank picked up our monthly contribution this morning. And Jesse, I wasn't there, but Jesse told Charlotte or Helene how wonderful it is, how much we're contributing, and that we're, there was a lot of food. I guess it was spaghetti and stuff. So pasta.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of pasta.
And next month is High Holiday Food Drive.
And what is that? That's everything.
Everything.
So you can donate your leftover chocolates.
I don't think so.
Oh, they won't accept it, or you don't think any of our congregants will give it?
I'd probably not give it.
I'll give spaghetti, I'll give paper towels, but I'm not giving chocolate. That's a request. That's unreasonable. Okay, Marcia, comment.
I was reading on the top of page 142, Rabbi Isaac, and he says, each Jew is an example of the doing of justice for God. And that's a very nice way to kind of end.
Okay, Steve, back to you for the final blessing.
Very good. Final blessing together. Baruch atah
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan Torah emet v'chayei olam l'tav b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai
Torah.
Blessed is our God, ruler of the universe,
who has given us the teaching of truth, implanting within us eternal life. Blessed is Adonai, giver of the Torah.
Amen.
Next week is divorce laws, I believe. Is that correct?
Well, that should be exciting.
Marriage and
divorce. And yes, so we'll see what happens there. Anyway, I'll see you soon, and sei gesund.
Thank you.
And thank you.
See you at book club if I don't forget.
Okay. Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Feel better, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Bye, y'all. See you Friday.